Hello, everyone, and thank you for participating in today's presentation of Musical Mosaic, America's Composers of Color. I'm Kristen Donahue, president of the Pioneer Valley Symphony, and I would like to welcome our special guests who are joining us from the Music of Asian America Research Center, musicologist Eric Hung and music theorist Dr. Nancy Yunhwa Rao. Thank you, Mr. Hung and Dr. Rao, for joining us this afternoon to share your perspectives on the history and music of Asian American composers. Tonight's event is part of the Pioneer Valley Symphony's ongoing effort to honor underrepresented composers and promote awareness and understanding of overlooked groups. We thank tonight's generous event sponsor, Florence Bank, who has supported the Pioneer Valley community for nearly 150 years with accessible and responsive family and small business banking. I would like to thank the season sponsor, Greenfield Northampton Cooperative Bank. This event is also made possible in part by generous support from the Massachusetts Cultural Council, a state agency, and New England Public Media. The PVS is one of the oldest established community orchestras in the U.S., with over 80 years providing exceptional musical opportunities to our local region. This year, we've expanded our outreach and our audience, in large part because of generous donors, sponsors, and volunteers supporting our work. If you would like to make a gift now, become a sustaining donor, or just shop in our store, please follow the link in your chat or visit our website. You can also support the PVS by joining our membership. We have multiple virtual programs this year, including opportunities to make music with our orchestra meetups, chorus meet and sings, or our virtual choir. We also have a virtual youth orchestra for students ages 8 to 18 with at least 2 years experience on any symphonic instrument. This program was designed specifically for the virtual format and has some pretty unique and fun features. Please click the link in your chat for more information and feel free to share the link with the student musicians in your life. And remember, for our virtual programs, there are no geographical restrictions. Be sure to mark your calendars for our next event, Life is a Dream, a celebration of Louis Spratlan, Saturday, February 20th at 7 p.m. It is my pleasure to introduce our host and moderator, Tianhui Ng, music director of the Pioneer Valley Symphony, the Mount Holyoke Symphony Orchestra, the Boston Opera Collaborative, and the Victory Players, and White Snake Projects. Tian has been extremely busy this year with many interesting projects, including Musical Mosaic. Thank you, Tian, for your collaborations with these fascinating presenters and for introducing the PVS community to this incredible wealth of history and music by unsung composers. And to all of you, thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoy the show.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tian. I'm the music director of the Pioneer Valley Symphony, and it's my great pleasure today to welcome you to this very exciting talk, Three Generations of Asian American Composers. We have two wonderful guests today, but before I introduce them, I just wanted to point out that because we're in a webinar format, you have several ways of communicating with us. In the chat function, you will have a way of messaging all the panelists as well as all the attendees if you have any questions, or to post just to the panelists, and we'll make sure that your questions are asked at the end in the question and answer session. There is also a question and answer option at the bottom of your screen, and if you're familiar with that, posting your question there would allow other people to see them and for you to upvote the questions as well. And don't worry if your questions don't show up in the chat. We probably receive them, and you can just message the panelists directly. And I will try to raise them either during the session today or at the Q&A at the end. Now, we have two amazing guests, as I mentioned. The first is Eric Hung, who is the Executive Director of the Music of Asian America Research Center and adjunct lecturer at the University of Maryland. His research focuses on Asian American music, music and trauma, and public musicology. He is also an active pianist and conductor who has performed in Germany, Austria, Hong Kong, and Australia, and throughout North America. Prior to joining the nonprofit world full-time, he was a tenured professor at Westminster Choir College of Rider University. He is co-director of the Westminster Chinese Music Ensemble and longtime member of the New York-based gamelan ensemble Dharma Swara. Dr. Hung also holds a PhD in musicology from Stanford University and an MLIS in archives and digital curation from the University of Maryland. And if that wasn't enough, we have the amazing Nancy Rao, who is professor of music at Rutgers University. Her work bridges musicology, music theory, Chinese opera, and Sinophone studies. She has published on the use of musical gestures, singing, and percussion patterns of Beijing opera in contemporary music by composers of Chinese origin. Her study on composer Ruth Crawford Seeger won the Best Article Award from the Society for American Music in 2009. Rao's study of Chinese in North America has led to writings on transnational issues and the production and and opera performance in Chinatown theaters. Her book, Chinatown Opera Theater in North America, includes analysis of networks, playbills, aria, and spectacles. It has received 3 book awards from the American Musicological Society, the Society for American Music, and the Association for Asian American Studies, and a certificate of merit from Association for Recorded Sound Collection. In addition, Rao has written about contemporary music by composers of Chinese heritage, including Chen Yi, Tan Dun, Bright Sheng, and Zhou Long. A recent article, The Concept of Shi, Chinese Aesthetics and Chen Yi's Happy Rain on a Spring Night, can be read in Music Theory Online. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Nancy and Eric.
Thank you so much, Tian. Thank you, Tian, for reaching out to us and for inviting us to give this talk. I want to thank Yana and her team at the Pioneer Valley Symphony for doing all the work involved in getting the series going. I want to thank Ben Grosscup also for the technical assistance that he has offered in the past week. And I'm sure there are others I have never met and don't know who have worked on this. So thank you very much for the invitation. Before I forget, I want to give a quick content warning. The last piece that we will talk about is about sexual assault. So please be aware of that. I will repeat the content warning before we get to the piece. So I'm going to share a slideshow, which is mostly pictures. Okay, so our talk is called The 3 Generations of Asian American Symphonic Music. So why only 3 generations when Asians have been in the US since the mid-18th century? Well, there are a variety of reasons. One is that immigration laws really made Asian immigration really small until after 1965. The other is the working class nature of Asian immigrants. Most of Asian, they run restaurants, they do run laundries, they are farmers, so on and so forth. So they're not the people who have access to the education and the resources which are often necessary for people to enter Western classical music. And also the doors of Western classical music institutions simply aren't open to non-white people really until after World War II. So we're talking about 3 generations. The first generation from the 1950s. So before the 1950s, there were isolated Asian students who studied at US conservatories, such as Oberlin has several. Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia had a few. But these were mostly students who were paid for by their national governments to come to the US to study, and then they were obligated to go back to their home countries after they finished studying. So they didn't make an impact on the US scene. They were here as students and then they left. But the first really generation to make a serious impact on Western classical music in North America, these are people who really started their careers in the 50s and 60s. And the reason for that is that the Cold War and the Korean War really led to significantly increased interest in Asia and what Asians are doing. And we'll talk about 2 composers who are of this generation. And then the next generation are people who, mostly immigrants who came in the 1970s and 1980s. These are first generation immigrants or 1.5 generation immigrants. 1.5 means you came as a child. You were born somewhere else and then you came, like, let's say under the age of 15, something like that. And then from the 1990s, there's a mix of immigrants and then US born Asian Americans who participate heavily in the Western classical scene. So these are the 3 generations that we talked about. There are lots and lots of Asian American composers who wrote symphonic music. So the 4 pieces that we chose to focus on today are pieces we felt would be very programmable for a regional orchestra. They don't require huge forces. And they're quite accessible. You can find them on YouTube. We didn't think it would be useful necessarily to talk about pieces which are very difficult to locate unless you have professional resources. So so here we go. I'm going to turn things over to Nancy to talk about Cho and Jung.
Hi, everyone. So happy to have the chance to share Zhou Wenzhong's story. Zhou Wenzhong was the first Asian American composer that made big on the scene of American music. He arrived in the United States in 1946, and initially he was going to study architecture, but soon he found out that he actually loved music much more. So he went to Boston, New England Conservatory to study. Next slide, please. And among his teacher, one of the most influential one was Nicholas Slonimsky, who was a strong advocate for modern music. And so I would say Zhou Wenzhong was there at the right time. He was also there when Schoenberg premiered his, famous string trio at Cambridge. So Zhou Wenzhong was exposed to a lot of very important contemporary music at that time. So next slide, please. And so after Boston, he went to New York and trying to figure out who to study. And upon recommendations from several people, including Slonimsky, he ended up studying with Edward Varese and become one of the most important assistant colleague of Varese for the next years. And then because of that, he become really deep at the center of modern music. And so so after that, his career just become one of that developed within the center, at the very center of modern music. Here you can see that he conversed with Bernstein and worked with Boulez for his composition. And he was also offered the job to be in Columbia University and become its composition faculty, and in fact chaired the composition faculty for many years, as well as associate dean of the art school. And here you can see that he later played an important role in the cultural group that visited China when it first opened in the 1970s. So his career was really very much in New York, and he took a very important role in cultural exchange as well as the development of modern music, because he, after all, taught in Columbia University from the 1960s to all the way to 1980s. So it was a remarkable service that he did. Okay, so that's just a quick survey of his life. So Zhou Wenzhong made a really big splash in the modern music scene very early on. So here are the 3 orchestra pieces that was performed and commissioned and received a lot of reviews. The first was Landscape, and the second was All in the Spring World, as you can see here. And what we are going to listen to today is And the Fallen Petals. This is a piece that had been commissioned by, and then during this commission, he was one of the composers. Can you show the next slide? But before I talk about the commission, let me just talk about one thing that shared by those 3 orchestra pieces is something that come across probably quite vividly, and that is the kind of literati tradition of Zhou Wenzhong. And this is associated with the kind of traditional training for a Chinese intellectual that they dwell on the poetry, calligraphy, and the painting. And so I found this table not exactly the same as the one Zhou Wenzhong has, but it must be something very similar to what he had, because all through his life, he's devoted to calligraphy as well as Chinese painting, and a lot of images associated with painting, Chinese, ink painting, was very instrumental to his music, and we'll see more of that. Next slide, please. So, And the Fallen Petals was commissioned by Louisville Orchestra. And on this page, I'm showing you all the other commission pieces at that time. And you can see Dalla Piccola, Henry Cowell, Rieger were all the composers that were very active during that time. So for him to have received this commission, as you can imagine, was quite an honor. And so in this piece, he involved quite a number of different things, and I want to bring them together for you to think about. First is that in this published score, which is published by the Peter, the very important publisher, it actually included Chinese, and I'm sure I didn't say, but I'm sure this is a calligraphy by himself. And it's also include a picture of him. And then on the right, you can see on one of the preface of the score, it's marked very clearly, this is by a Chinese composer. And it was, marked the kind of pride a Chinese intellectual has for himself. And so I just want to show you this preface to set a stage about how he conceived himself and how his work was, perceived by the publisher. Okay, next, please. And there are 2 poems that are associated with this piece, and it's very interesting to think about what they are. To the right is a poem by Mo Haoran, and it has the origin of the title of the piece, as you can see, and the fallen petals. This is one of the most well-known poems that all Chinese cultural kids growing up in Chinese culture would all have learned. And to the left is actually something much different, and that is a poem that talks about the kind of reflective nature of a Chinese intellectual. They see themselves as the lonely man stand in the nature, contemplating what's before them, and look forward to what's before and coming, and feel the future, the burden of the future, all on their shoulder, right? And for that, they feel a sense of responsibility, but also a sense of, solidarity and loneliness. And it's just a kind of profound poem. And I want to also mention that this very same poem was included in Zhou Wenzhong's last piece that he composed in 2007. So this is kind of a thing that to think about how he combined these 2 things. One is kind of a more playful, natural, and the other one is a very, very profound reflection. So let's see how he combined these 2 together. Next, please. And so in this poem, he talks about that there are 4 sections, and the beginning is more quiet, and then there's kind of a storm that breaks out, and that, so you can see the part 2 really comes from that more playful kind of tune, right? So the flower fall on the ground, and the storm coming, and then so on and so forth. So the piece has actually a really an interesting arc of the beginning in this kind of more mystic sound, and then into this busy and loud and kind of very eventful, and then come back to the more natural thing. Okay, next, please. And so since we have only a little bit of time, I just want to show you 3 basic things that you'll be listening. The first one is this, opening that's really solitude and beautiful and peaceful. And the middle one is the blue one is the point that you still hear the kind of background, the large scenery comes out. And the third one in particular, with that fast note you can see in the last measure, you will see this kind of throw and start to have the action. So let's have a listen. By the way, you don't need to worry about the text. Okay, I want to draw your attention to this landscape. This landscape is really the inner imagery for Zhou Wenzhong, and his whole career. I feel he's making the sonic landscape in variety of different ways. But I just chose a landscape painting for you to get into that mode of his imagery. So next excerpt, actually, I think I'm going to skip. For the interest of time, this just shows the middle section that are much more reflecting this kind of a flower falling on the ground. So I hope with this you get a sense of this generation of composer like Zhou Wenzhong, who's very much tied into the Chinese literary tradition. Eric, yours next. Oh, actually, before that, I can just show. So this is the good, huge, praises for Zhou Wenzhong's piece, and that's how he really established his career in the United States. Okay, that's it.
Great. So I will talk about Paul Chihara, who was similar in some ways to Zhou Wenzhong and different in some ways. He was born in the U.S. He was born in Seattle 3 years before the U.S. entry into World War II. And this is really significant because in 1942, he was living in the Barred Zone, which you see in the pink on the map. If you are Japanese descent and live in the Barred Zone, you were forced to move from 1942 to 1945. So he and his family was moved to Minidoka, which is in Idaho. It's about an hour and a half east of Boise on a modern highway. And Boise is a happening city now. It was not in 1942. So it was really in the middle of nowhere. So this is the Minidoka camp. You can see the arrow. His family lived in block 14, barrack 2, section E. So you can see a picture of block 14. I don't know which barrack it is, but you can see how small the space for the family is. Each dividing line that you see in the building is one section. So your entire family has to live in that one section. And that's how he spent, his year from like age 4 to age 7 was in Minidoka. And the effect of living in this incarceration camp is sort of contradictory. So on the one hand, there are lots and lots of people on these camps that were trying to show themselves to be American and trying to be loyal to American. They formed jazz bands. They formed baseball teams. They have camp dances, which are like, any high school dance that you have in the 1940s. But at the same time, these camps also enabled the dissemination of Japanese traditional arts in a way that was not easily possible, because obviously Japanese Americans lived in scattered places. They often ran grocery stores or restaurants and things like that. So they were not, or actually most I would say are probably farmers. So there probably weren't a teacher of a Japanese traditional instrument within a reasonable commute of where you live. But the camp actually enabled a lot of children to really be exposed to Japanese traditional arts in a way that might not have been possible without the incarceration. So in many ways, the experience of incarceration made them more American in some ways, but also more Japanese in some ways. So after he grew up, he ultimately studied music. He got a PhD at Cornell University, where he studied with Robert Palmer, who was a major composition teacher at that time. And then afterwards, he went to Europe to study with Nadia Boulanger and Ernest Pepin. But I think his probably most important teacher was at Tanglewood, where he studied with Günter Schuler. Günter Schuler was the advocate of something that he called the third stream. And what he was really interested in is the fusion of classical music and jazz. But Günter Schuler was somebody who also, classical music and jazz are his worlds, right? That's the music that he grew up with. But he also encouraged people to combine all sorts of music in whatever they wrote. So the first really significant sort of professional compositions that Paul Chihara did is a series called the Tree series. And it was started during his time studying with Günter Schuler. And they were inspired both by the beauty of the Berkshire Mountains, but also a desire to write something Japanese. I will talk a little bit more about that, but a lot of that means a focus on texture and time. These are elements which are not as much emphasized in a lot of Western classical music, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries. And at the beginning of his career, many people said he was going to be the next Toru Takemitsu, who was this Japanese composer. Some American connections, but he lived in Japan all of his life, who really tried to combine Western classical modernist techniques with Japanese aesthetics. So the Tree series consists of a number of chamber pieces for 1 to 5 instruments plus electronics. And then the last of the Tree series, the Tree music series, is Forest Music, which is an orchestral piece. It is like Cho En-jung's and the Fallen Petals, a commission by the Louisville Symphony, Louisville Orchestra. And so on the right side of the screen, you can see an ink painting called Landscapes of Autumn and Winter by Sesshu Toyo, who was a 15th century monk, Zen Buddhist monk and painter. And if it looks somewhat like Chinese painting, it is because he was actually very much influenced by Song Dynasty painting. He was one of the few people who got to visit China during his lifetime. He was already established as a painter before his visit, but he also was very much influenced by what he saw there. So I think you can see, if you look at the top of the painting, the top 40% of the painting, it is almost all blank, right? I mean, there's just a little bit of textures here and there, but it's also an interesting combination of realism and abstraction. There are certain things that look, the leaves of the tree can look somewhat realistic, but there are certain things that are very abstract about this painting. It's a combination of the two. If you look closely near the bottom, you can see a person walking up a set of stairs towards probably the monastery, which is at the bottom of the mountain. So humans are a part of these landscape paintings, but they're always very small. They're also often very angular, right? So in forest music, Chihara really tries to look at what these shapes, how these shapes and shadings and things like that can be translated into sound. And so this is the last minute and a half of the piece, and you can see what he did with this. So as with a lot of music based on Japanese aesthetic, the concept of ma is really important in Paul Chihara's music, at least the early music. Ma is a concept of negative space. It is where what is absent is as important as what is there, right? So this is not a piece with much melody, right? It's just a sense of, this is a scene I'm looking at, and I hope you can enjoy the scene, right? And very much that is the nature of this music. So at the beginning of his career, people were thinking very much that Chihara would be the next Toru Takemitsu, but because of various circumstances, his career really took a different direction. He turned to theater and ultimately to film. In 1973, he became the composer in residence of the San Francisco Ballet. So he was writing a lot of dance music. And then shortly after that, he was asked to write music for the film Farewell to Manzanar. He did not, he was not trying to get into the film industry, but this was a film about the Japanese internment. So they very naturally turned to him and asked if he would be interested. And it actually took a bit of convincing for him to be interested in the project, but ultimately he did it. And then, since then, his career really took off as a film and television composer with over 100 credits to his name. He also became the professor of film music at UCLA and then later NYU, where I think he still teaches. I don't think he's retired. So yeah, so that is Paul Chihara. And I will now turn it back to Dr. Rao to talk about Chen Yi.
So as Eric has mentioned at the beginning, the whole generation of composers came in 1980. And that is a very important group of composers that has shaped the contemporary American music scene in significant ways. So I chose to talk about one of them, and that is Chen Yi. And so she was born in Guangzhou, and she was very important part of this kind of Western family where she learned piano and violin and was able to. Eric, can you do next one? And was very, very well versed in Western music since she was young because both her parents were doctors. And you all know that China went through Cultural Revolution. So she was sent to the countryside, and with her music, she continued to kind of learn and play, but in a very subdued and folk fashion. So that's her life before she really started the serious study of music. But during that time, the Cultural Revolution, one of the most important, almost all-encompassing music that people can hear was a cultural, what's called a model opera or revolution opera. And with these 8 pieces, people listen to from the radio, from the speakers in the community, and or on stage is adapted all over the country with one standard production. And this revolutionary opera was very interesting combination of Western symphony orchestra together with the Chinese opera. So it uses a lot of Chinese opera materials, most importantly, the Chinese percussion. And later you will see that these hugely influence composers like Chen Yi. And so after the Cultural Revolution was over and the education system opened up again, there's a nationwide entrance exam. And it's during that very first entrance exam, a whole class of brilliant musician composers were admitted to study at the Central Conservatory of Music in Beijing. And on this famous picture of a class of 1978, that's what they were called, you see the important people. You see Chen Yi on the left. You see Tan Dun in his extreme youth in the middle. You also see Zhou Long on the right, and that is Chen Yi's future husband. So this group of people were educated together, and they were educated in a variety of different ways. First, they studied all the composers and the skills, and then they went to these, countryside to collect folk music, and then also so on and so forth. So they were very, very well educated in all sorts of things. So through the help of Zhou Wenzhong in his position in Columbia University, Zhou Wenzhong brought over quite a number of them to study in Columbia University. And so Chen Yi followed her husband Zhou Long to come to United States. And among her most important teachers were Mario Davidovsky, and then she immediately became a very kind of notable composer. She never studied with these 2 composers, Babbitt and Carter, but in this picture you can see that she gradually rise to significance. And the next picture will show the context in which that she composed the piece we're listening to. So in the 1990s, she was a resident composer for Women's Philharmonic. It was conducted by Joan Falletta. And it's with this collaboration, she was in the Bay Area for quite a number of years and produced this recording. And this symphony was also then, part of that production. I was very lucky to be actually in San Francisco during that time and hear the premiere of this performance. And the next picture shows that this was an important community for Chen Yi. She composed this music in this lively, really grassroots kind of orchestra, and she performed and worked closely with the performers to produce this music. And in it, there's a lot of really beautiful sections and showcase these instruments. And this is something that I captured just recently when they were talking about how nice it was to work together. But there's also a sad story associated with the symphony that I'm talking about, because this was during the time that she lost her father. So this symphony was actually in memory of her father. And so the whole piece starts with the very, very low, just, kind of a deep kind of sadness. And I don't want to play this opening for you because it's really kind of hard to hear it that closely. And so gradually from this deep sorrow, then you get to this kind of epiphany. And this word epiphany is actually something that Chen used to describe the moment of rise out of that deep sorrow and see a little bit light of the day. And then I'll just foreshadow what happened later. So later the piece then move on to really beautiful melodic section. But after that, you will see a whole section that sounds almost like, Chinese opera percussion cast it onto the canvas of an orchestra. It was the most striking section of the piece. And then after that section, you move back to this kind of sound, clarity, and nothingness. And from that nothingness, more music come back to it. And at the end of this piece, you will hear Chinese percussion in the most kind of characteristic way. You hear it, you can hear that this kind of Chinese opera stage, it was like, a gesture toward her father who majestically walked away from the stage. At least that's how I hear it. So I want to hear at the beginning this gesture of epiphany is a kind of sculpturing of sound. Let's have a listen just for about 45 seconds. Okay, this is the second section. It's just beautiful, beautiful melody. I want you to have a listen. Okay, next, please. So this is one that you will hear the importance of percussion in Chinese music. And this also shows the ways in which Chen is deeply connected to the root of people's music that's full of, percussion in the Chinese tradition. Let's have a listen. Okay, so just before closing, I want to say this is not the real score because I'm a theorist. I like to kind of, show the underlying pattern. So you can see in this underlying pattern of the rhythm, the interval between the group of, the busy percussion sound gets to be shorter and shorter and shorter until it continues to bring it to the climax. And that's a really effective. I think we didn't play it as loud as it really should sound, but you can imagine that. So back to you, Eric.
Thank you so much. So the fourth composer, this is from the third generation. You can see that she is very young still, born in 1983, Reena Esmail. And Tien told me that he went to school with her at Yale. So yeah, born in Chicago, so she's American born. She started to play piano when she was 11 and became very, very good very quickly. So the picture on the left is her first time standing in front of Juilliard at age 14. She went to Juilliard 3 years later. But this was her first visit to New York City and her first time in front of Juilliard. Her father is Muslim and her mother is Catholic. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that Indian classical music really was not a part of her family upbringing, which is really a Hindu tradition. So, but as an Indian American composer, people kept asking her if she was going to incorporate Indian classical music into her own compositions, even though it's not part of her own family upbringing. So ultimately, she decided to take a class on Indian classical music at Yale as a graduate student. She knew very little about Indian classical music until she was in her mid-20s. And then ultimately, she was so inspired by the class that she decided she got a Fulbright to go study in India for a year. And the picture on the right is part of a birthday message that she created for a friend of hers while she was in India. So that's why she's holding the Y. But this is Reena Esmail in India. So the piece that I'm going to talk about is a piece called Black Iris. And again, this is a piece about sexual assault. So please be aware of that. And this is a picture of Reena Esmail at the premiere of right after the premiere of the piece with the Chihara Sinfonietta with me and Chen, who was the music director there. The piece, the commission came in early 2017, and the first name of this piece is Avez, which is the Hindu word for voice. And as she was writing the piece, the Me Too movement really took off. So she decided to bring her personal experience into the piece, and she renamed the piece #MeToo. So this is the, sorry, I need to move where the pictures are from Zoom because I can't read it. So this is what she wrote. The harm itself happened when I was in high school and college, but I only began to admit it even to myself in 2015. When I first wrote honestly about it in words. And one of the first things I put in this writing was that I was hoping at some point that I could express those emotions, which were still so raw at that point in orchestral work. This piece, #MeToo, written almost 3 years later, is that work. So the piece was premiered and went very well, but unfortunately, a year after the premiere, Esmail felt that she had to rename the piece. And this is what she said. I decided to directly title this work #MeToo as a challenge, which orchestras would agree to program a work that asked them and their audiences to engage with the fact that women composers, myself included, are often sexually abused by the same system that teaches them to compose. As it turned out, very few did. The moment passed and the piece had to be retitled. It guts me to my core to feel that years of trauma for so many women can be so easily deemed passé as soon as a hashtag stops trending. But I hope that the message is not lost. So she ultimately renamed the piece Black Iris after this Georgia O'Keeffe painting. And why Black Iris is because actually many people see this painting as a metaphor for female genitalia. So this piece uses a compositional method that is very common for Esmail's works since 2012, which is that she chooses a raga, and she always chooses a raga with Western ears in mind. So for this piece, she chose the rag Charukeshi, which for Western ears mixes major and minor in very interesting ways. If you can read notation, Western notation, you can see that it uses a major third, but the 6th and 7th scale degrees are a minor to Western ears. And a raga in Indian classical music isn't just a scale. It's a particular way of going up and a particular way of going down, right? And so she would improvise on the raga and then come up with a short tune that she really likes. And then this is a bandish. And then she would write the piece based on the bandish. So the bandish that she improvised and ultimately really liked is this. And this is her singing the bandish. So this bandish becomes the basis of Black Iris. And I'm going to play an excerpt that occurs around 2/3 of the way through the piece. So the first part, the first 7 minutes or so, 8 minutes of this 13-minute piece it's really sort of fairly motoric, and it's all based on fragments of this bandish, getting shorter and shorter and shorter, louder and louder and louder. And then at this particular point, it hits a point of trauma and everything stops. And then afterwards, she asked the women in the orchestra to come in singing one by one to restart the piece and to bring it to the conclusion. So we will hear the moments before the trauma, and then we'll hear the women coming in to restart the piece. The piece goes on for about 3 or 4 minutes after the excerpt I'll play, but I think you'll get the idea. Sorry about that. So, and the piece goes on for about 3 or 4 minutes after that to bring it into more cohesion and ultimately a second loud section. So I hope the 4 pieces give you a good idea of the types of music that Asian American composers are writing. There are many, many different styles, and there are a lot more research, I think, that really needs to be done about Asian Americans in the orchestra world, right? So this is a photo of the recent Philadelphia Orchestra. You can see that, in the violin section, you're dealing with a probably Asian majority section, right? And we often think of, a lot of Asians being in Western classical music world, orchestral world these days. But there isn't that much research that has been done on the actual players. And we can see that it is actually a fairly recent phenomenon. I think in many ways, Asian composers are the first people to be able to break into the world, because you really only need one person to vouch for you to get in. You need the conductor who really wants to perform your work to get in. And then conductors, I think, are sort of the second group to get into the orchestral world. But it is actually very difficult for Asian instrumentalists to actually break into the world. You can count the number of Asian orchestral musicians in the 1950s on one hand. This is Ma Si-hong, who is he played with the Cleveland Orchestra from 1952 to 1957. But in other orchestras, the Boston Symphony hired their first permanent member in 1969. She is still a member of the orchestra. Chicago Symphony hired their first Asian in 1977. That's John Brusier, the clarinetist, and he is still a member of the orchestra. The New York Philharmonic did not hire an Asian until 1977. That's Myung-Hae Kim. That was actually Zubin Mehta's first hire. And the second Asian hire is Yoko Takabe, who is better known these days as the mother of Alan Gilbert. So I hope there's a lot more work that needs to be done, but I hope this presentation gives you a good sense of where we can start, and hopefully we can program a lot more Asian American composers in the future. Nancy, do you have anything you want to add?
I think it's a very important point that you at the end, that there are so many different styles, and even all those 1978 class has very, very many different styles. So it has a lot to explore.
Well, I think, I'm echoing what our audience here in thanking both Eric and Nancy. Thank you firstly for joining us, but, thank you for opening up this immense world of music to us, and for sharing all this music. I want to just quickly call out to our audience members to say that, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, or feel free to put them in the Q&A, or feel free to raise your hand, and we will be able to allow you to speak. And I'm just going to get the ball rolling here. I know that we are scratching the surface here, and this was always and just as a point of note for everybody, we knew that this was going to be the case at the Pioneer Valley Symphony, but we had to start somewhere. And I said to them, I said to Eric and Nancy, just start somewhere, and we will begin exploring after that. Hopefully we can have them back again and to share more music with us. But would you speak a little bit about, just like a running list of musics and styles that you were just referring to, Nancy, for example, that didn't quite make it in this session, that like that we could all just go and get in Google and learn about and find out?
I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure what to.
There are all these other styles that you mentioned by all these different.
Yeah. I think Eric had prepared a list of work to share with the audience. In it, you will see a lot of different style. And I have actually been thinking about that, even just with this 1978 group, they're very different. And they're, like, for example, Bryce Shen, he's from Shanghai, but he was basically at the same time, he was very influenced by the Bernstein and the kind of orchestra sweeping kind of style. And you also have Tan Dun, who's basically, part of the downtown scene, and really brought the downtown scene to uptown, right? So he's very experimental, and he, when I went to hear his first Emperor, the opera commissioned by Metropolitan Opera, at the beginning, I was basically kind of have this chill down my spine, because it's experimental opera, but it quickly changed to something else. But it just goes to show that their styles are all very different, and even with one composer like Chen herself, some of her pieces will use a lot more folk song, and some of other pieces would be much more abstract, and so she straddled over quite a number of different type of performing group. Chen Yi also wrote a lot for middle school, high school kind of ensembles. The band conductor in my school, are familiar with her work, and she also wrote for organ. So it's a fabulous group of different composers, and in the more recent one, Huang Ruo and Du Yun each charge their own different distinctive character. And if you listen to Du Yun's piece, you would really kind of baffle. Are we going to group this under the same umbrella of Asian American composer that we put Zhou Wen Zhongying? Wait a second. It's odd, right? At some point it becomes odd to put them under the same big umbrella because they're so different.
Yeah.
Eric, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I mean they're very different. There is no Asian American style, which is one problem in, it's a marketing problem, right? It's one, so it goes from very, someone like Zhou Tian who writes really sort of neo-romantic music, that you heard at the very beginning, to like extraordinarily experimental work, and I mean, Du Yun writes popular music as well as classical music, right? And it's good at both. So, yeah. And I can see Nathaniel Hara's question: how do you define Asian American composers? In your opinion, what is the difference between Asians in the U.S. and Asian Americans writing music versus Asian American composers? So at the Music of Asian America Research Center, we define Asian Americans as Asian American composers as people who think they're Asian Americans who write music, right? I mean, not every there are lots of Asians in the U.S. who don't think they're Asian Americans, right? They think themselves as Chinese or as whatever. I mean, they might really emphasize their ethnic identity over an Asian identity, or they might not think themselves as American at all, right? So we let the composers decide that they are Asian American, and yeah, I mean, I don't say Asian Americans who write music every time, because I think that's just a bit clunky for for giving a talk. But yeah, that's really what I mean.
Thank you. We have our next question here is from
Yeah.
Robert Holdsworth. Is there a reason why the St. Louis, and I think it might be the Louisville Symphony Orchestra, commissioned the works by the first two composers, an Asian community or director or musician in the orchestra, or just generally an interest in new music?
Yeah, the Louisville Orchestra is the #1 commissioning orchestra in mid-century U.S. I forget the name of the conductor, Robert Whitney, right? Robert Whitney, I think, was the one. I think he taught at U of Louisville. I might be making this up. I did not prepare this, but I think he taught there, and he was asked by the city, how can you put the Louisville Orchestra on the map? And he said one thing, to put it on the map, you can create this. You can really be the premier commissioning orchestra, the orchestra that plays new music, and that's the city bought it, right? And they commissioned dozens, probably over 100 pieces in mid 20th century of all the great American composers, and they recorded them. That was part of the deal, right? So yes, it was an amazing project that they did, and I don't think has ever been tried anywhere else.
Yeah, the picture I showed that indicates the list of commission that Louisville Symphony Orchestra did was actually published in Musical Quarterly. So it was indeed, and it was published I think that year, the year after its commission, so 1956. So it was really a way for them to do that. And in the past 30 years, you will notice that the Seattle symphony orchestra is doing a lot of that, and it has a lot to do with the conductor as well. So I think a lot of interesting thing happens, I think, because a person or an institution make an effort, and that's amazing how it has a huge impact on the history.
So thank you so much. And I just posted Louisville Orchestra's own record of what Robert Whitney did in the chat, as well as a link to the orchestra so you can find out more. Here's our next question, and it's actually from our course director, Sarah Paquette. I wonder if Eric and Nancy would speak more to their work at the Music of Asian America Research Center.
Sure. No, I mean, our goal is to use music to teach Asian American history and experience. We would love to promote this music as well, but that's not our main goal. Our main goal is really to see how can we use music to really make Asian American history part of American history. That would be the short answer. We do oral histories. We will start releasing them in March. We have about 35 which are ready to go. We didn't want to release like jaggedly, so we wanted to release it like weekly. So we've been saving it for a couple of years. So we'll start releasing them in March. Right now we have a large initiative on citizenship. That is because we are coming up on the 100th anniversary of 3 really, really important court cases about Asians' inability to get citizenship. So Asians could not be citizens until after World War II, really. As naturalized citizens. They could be born U.S. citizens, but if you immigrate to the U.S., you could not become a citizen until really after World War II. So that was, so there were, in 1922 and 23, there were a series of 3 court cases that went to the Supreme Court that challenged that, and the Supreme Court turned it down. So that's the Supreme Court said Asians could not be naturalized citizens at that point. So so we're trying to commemorate that. So we have a podcast series that we're working on. I see someone in our one of our attendees is actually participating in that. Brian Singdala is going to be a part of the podcast series as well. So
if I can add to that, I would just say I think Eric start working on this center as a depository for materials that are soon to disappear, kind of music cultural, material culture, as well as documents and so on and so forth for future studies. And I think it's very important because the Chinese American or Asian American materials are typically not found in your regular archive. So if you go to the Performing Art Library at Lincoln Center, you would not find too much to use. And so when I wrote my book on Chinatown Opera Theaters of North America, I basically have to create my own archive. And after I create something like that, it's possible to write a book, but how about people in the future, right? So another thing that Eric did was also started the process of interviewing musicians or people who work in music in various variety, even the dissident of people. So to create a sense of an archive someplace, and then for the heritage to be able to be continued. And I think it's also very much focused on performing art, which is not the focus of a lot of the other places, right? A lot of other kind of institution deals most with, the larger issue. And the music and performing art and its significance to the lives of Asian Americans is sometimes kind of pushed to the side. And so to create an historical narrative of it, we first need to have a chronology, documentations, and so on and so forth. So this is a central it's a very important, I think, step toward preserving material before they all disappear.
Yeah, and one thing that we're working on right now is we're trying to document community music ensembles, and we didn't actually realize how important that might be because, I mean, the reality is that COVID is going to change every ensemble, every community ensemble. I would expect half of them to probably disappear, I mean, realistically. And even the ones that are able to continue, their membership will be very different. I mean, if you don't do something for 2 years, you might do something different afterwards, right? So, so one of our big projects right now is to really document community music ensembles. It's very hard to find information about ensembles that no longer exist. Nobody keeps records of them. It's usually in somebody's basement. Whoever ran the ensemble is is in their basement. You don't know who that person is, so it's like even if you find out something about the ensemble and you don't even know who to contact, right, or how to contact them. But we feel that community ensembles are really important because these are the people who play weddings or festivals, community festivals, or teach the community children. So we feel that this is important, but there's no natural place for this material to go. So we're trying to document some of those things.
This is such amazing work that the both of you do, and I feel so inspired by the work that you do. Such an important work, and also just for me, as a first generation person here in the U.S., I remember when I was looking for information, this was exactly where I landed, was at your webpage, and hence we could actually have this talk in the first place. Just a testament to how important it is to have such a resource available to scholars and to communities. I just want to echo what everybody else said already multiple times in the chat, but thank you so much for coming to our talk series and sharing this music with us, and we really look forward to doing more work with you in the future. Thank you again to Eric Hung and Nancy Rao, and we're at the end of today's session, but next week we have a celebration of the music of Lou Spratland, who for many years was professor of composition at Amherst College, and we'll be doing a retrospective of his work with lots of fascinating music and also lots of issues in the music on February 20th. And so please do come and join us. And this musical mosaic series continues as well. We have Kareem Rustam coming up and very, very exciting. Now, there's one question here in the from the chat that I wanted to address, which is that some folks are asking how they could save the chat, and we're aware that many people can't save it using the 3-dot function. Instead, what will happen is that after this show, we will email all the people who signed up to participate, and we will give you access to look at this video, but also to share the chat log with you so that all the resources that we mentioned there can be accessible to you. So thank you again. Thank you to Eric. Thank you to Nancy. And have a great evening, everybody.
Thank you, Tianhui.
Thank you so much.